I was halfway through scaling a base out on my dock, sun just beginning to melt across the lake in golden streaks, when a white catering truck rumbled up the gravel road to my private cabin, doors wide open, classical music blaring, and a woman in heels stepping out like she was at a country club rather than 30 miles off the highway on land I legally owned outright. I set down my fishing pole and watched as 3 more vehicles followed, one with folding chairs, another with tents and floral arrangements, and the last one, a white stretch limousine that took a solid 60 seconds to make the turn, sealed the insanity of what I was witnessing. This wasn't a delivery error. This was a full-scale wedding invasion, and I hadn't been invited, despite it taking place directly on the soil I paid taxes for, mowed, and maintained. The irony didn't hit slowly, it smacked me across the face. As the catering staff began unloading trays of hors d'oeuvres like they owned the place, I walked up the hill only to be greeted by none other than Karen Witherspoon, the HOA president of our so-called community, standing in a sequin shawl, holding a clipboard, and directing people as if she was orchestrating a royal gala. She turned, smiled like nothing was wrong, and said, "Oh, I assumed you were out of town this weekend. You don't mind, do you?" At that exact moment, someone in a tuxedo tripped over my custom fire pit and broke the lid. I blinked, felt my fingers twitch, and knew this would end with tears, but not mine. Karen had always been a problem. She was the kind of woman who wielded HOA regulations like they were state law, citing noise ordinances if you sneezed too loud or suggesting you repaint your mailbox because it clashed with neighborhood tones. But until now, she'd never dared breach the invisible but very real boundary around my cabin, which sat apart from the rest of the lakeside properties and wasn't even subject to the HOA's domain. The thing is, I'd built that cabin 15 years ago before the association even formed. I'd kept it off their maps, fought their fees in court once, and won. Karen hated that. She hated that she couldn't find me, couldn't boss me, couldn't rope me into her petty political games. And now, in what must have been a delusional stroke of revenge masquerading as entitlement, she decided to use my land to host her niece's wedding, the niece who apparently thought a rustic private lake vibe would look great on Instagram. I followed her line of vision to a handmade wooden sign staked directly into the dirt next to my dock that read, "Welcome to the Witherspoon wedding. Love is in the air." My name wasn't on it. My permission certainly wasn't. I stood there in stunned silence, then turned and walked back to my porch where my dog, Hank, was watching everything unfold with more intelligence than half the guests stumbling around with centerpieces. I sat down, opened a beer, and decided to observe, just for a while, because part of me needed to understand the depth of her audacity. I watched as strangers opened my outdoor fridge, used my custom-built deck for staging photos, and even dragged one of my kayaks down to the water. Every few minutes, I'd hear someone refer to Karen's lake house, and each time, the phrase bit deeper until it almost became funny. Almost. But then I saw them start putting up string lights, directly into my trees with actual nails, and the fuse of something inside me officially burned out. It wasn't just arrogance. It was a full-blown hijacking. That night, I went to dinner with my old friend Cal, a retired military logistics officer who now worked in private security. I told him everything, laid out the photos I'd taken, described the vehicles, the timeline, the boldness. He listened silently, then said the words that changed the trajectory of the entire situation. "They're assuming you won't fight back. That's their whole game." And with that, we formed a plan, not to confront or shout or threaten. No. Something colder. Something far more satisfying. We were going to let the wedding happen. Let them set everything up, send out the invites, fill the road with SUVs and pastel dresses and champagne buckets, and then lock the only gate that led to the cabin. And we were going to do it an hour before the ceremony began. The next morning, I returned to the property early. Karen wasn't there, but her wedding crew certainly was. I counted 4 delivery vans, a catering tent, and a DJ testing sound levels on my deck. When the DJ asked if I was maintenance, I nodded and waved, then slipped behind my tool shed to install a new industrial-strength padlock on the access gate at the only road leading to the lake. There were 2 entrances technically, but only one had vehicle access. The second was a narrow footpath I'd long ago disguised with brush after a bear scare. I placed trail cameras at key choke points, positioned Hank on guard duty by the shed, and left through the back way, locking everything tight. I didn't warn Karen. I didn't post signs. I didn't even text her. I just waited, quietly. But before I left, I made one last stop. There was an old neighbor named Roger who lived just across the ridge, someone Karen had snubbed repeatedly because his house lacked curb appeal. Roger was a retired surveyor and still had access to topographical maps from before the HOA redistricting. He confirmed, over coffee and a slice of lemon pie, that not only was my cabin excluded from the HOA zone, but the spot where Karen had erected her decorative arch was technically outside even the township's claimed border. In short, she had 0 legal standing to be there. We documented everything, notarized copies, and even printed out a few for fun. That afternoon, I watched from the ridge as final preparations went underway. White chairs fanned out like an open deck of cards. Music played. Guests began arriving. Someone popped a bottle of sparkling wine. Karen wore a hat with a feather that defied gravity. Then I saw her face twist as she walked toward the gate, waving her hands dramatically. I knew what had happened. The gate didn't open. Her master key didn't fit anymore. She paced, called someone, tried again. A few guests had to park roadside. Then more, until a line of vehicles stretched a quarter-mile, backed up with guests in heels and tuxedos walking down the gravel with visible annoyance. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her body language read like a live opera: confusion, panic, forced charm, rising fury. I stood behind a tree and watched her crumble in slow motion. The crescendo came when the bride arrived, Karen's niece, only to realize she'd have to hike half a mile in stilettos. She refused. The groom argued. A champagne bucket tip. Someone's dress got mud on it. And then, in front of 70 people, Karen burst into tears at the road, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. And me? I took one last photo, then walked back down the ridge with a calmness I hadn't felt in months. The revenge had only just begun. The morning after the wedding disaster, I woke up to the soft hum of my coffee pot and the stillness that only comes after a storm. Not the weather kind, but the social kind, the kind that makes its way through whispers and sideways glances and text messages flying at light speed. I didn't need to check my phone to know it was blowing up, and when I did, sure enough, the HOA group chat, which I had been forcibly added to years ago and muted almost instantly, had over 70 unread messages. There were photos, questions, demands, and a particularly passive-aggressive voice memo from Karen that started with, "I'm trying to stay calm," but which is always the prelude to a monologue of threats disguised as disappointment. The guests had been stranded at the locked gate for over an hour, the bride left in tears, and one of the groomsmen twisted his ankle attempting to scale the ditch like it was an obstacle course. Karen's post-wedding meltdown had turned into a multi-day cleanup operation, not just physically, tables abandoned midfield, wilted flowers tossed by the lake, but socially, as she now had to explain to the groom's family why they'd been invited to a venue that was, technically and legally, stolen. But instead of apologizing, as a reasonable person might do, Karen had decided to go full martyr, painting herself as the victim of my unneighborly behavior and attempting to redirect the blame to some mysterious gate malfunction that she insisted I must have known about. I sipped my coffee, opened my laptop, and started organizing the footage. I had set up 4 trail cameras across the property the day before the wedding, plus 2 mounted on the porch disguised as birdhouses. I had over 6 hours of time-stamped footage showing caterers walking across my grass, dragging electrical cords, and one particularly brave soul opening my outdoor freezer and helping himself to popsicles. One of the best clips, though, was of Karen herself, casually walking through the property with a clipboard, giving orders and even scolding a staffer for placing flowers too close to my favorite tree, as if she had lived there her whole life. I uploaded all the files to a secure folder and made a few choice edits, just in case I needed a public compilation titled, Unauthorized Wedding on Private Property, HOA Edition. I wasn't ready to release it yet, but the knowledge that I could was enough to keep me patient. Meanwhile, I decided to reinforce my position, literally. I drove into town and bought a new reinforced gate lock with a coded keypad system, solar-powered just for fun, and made sure to program it with a code that only I and my friend Cal would know. Cal, ever the strategist, also advised setting up a remote backup, one of those emergency lock release mechanisms you can trigger by app, so I could trap or release someone at will. The irony of turning my lake cabin into a security fortress wasn't lost on me, but after what Karen had pulled, it seemed only fair. I also put up laminated signs that read, "Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted," at every entry point, followed by another smaller sign that simply read, "Yes, we mean you, Karen," which I knew she'd see eventually. Later that afternoon, I spotted her SUV creeping up the road. It stopped just before the gate, and she stepped out in a pressed pantsuit like she was about to run a press conference. She stood at the gate, dialed her phone, and within seconds mine buzzed with a call I didn't answer. Then came the text, "We need to talk about what happened yesterday. I'm on your property. Please respond." I watched her through binoculars from the upstairs window. She paced, dialed again, and finally turned back toward her car, probably realizing that without access, she wasn't going to get far. Minutes later, she posted in the HOA group chat, "Can anyone get in touch with our neighbor at Lot 9? He's not answering, and there are some serious issues to resolve after the unfortunate gate incident." I didn't respond. The next day, a man in khakis and a badge showed up, local code enforcement. I greeted him politely and invited him onto the porch. He explained that he was following up on a complaint filed by a member of the HOA, alleging that I had unlawfully modified a shared access road and blocked community access to a lakefront amenity. I laughed, then handed him a printed copy of my land survey, tax records, and a photo of the old property deed showing that the road and everything beyond it belonged exclusively to me. To his credit, he reviewed everything thoroughly, nodded, and said, "Well, that clears that up." But just before leaving, he added, "She really thought she had a case." I shrugged. She always thinks she has a case. Karen's next move was more direct. A certified letter arrived 2 days later, signed by the HOA board, stating that I was being fined $2,500 for community disruption, hostile behavior, and obstruction of a planned neighborhood event. The wording was laughable, especially considering I wasn't part of the HOA and had a legal exemption carved out when the community was first incorporated. Still, they were betting I wouldn't want to go through the hassle of fighting back. What they didn't know was that I lived for this kind of hassle. I made a copy of the letter, drafted a formal response, and forwarded both to my attorney, who specialized in property law and once helped a farmer sue a state agency for trying to reroute a public hiking trail. He called me 10 minutes after receiving the documents and said, "You want to go nuclear or just annoying?" I asked for both. That week, we began the counteroffensive. My lawyer filed a cease and desist letter against the HOA for harassment and fraudulent fines, citing legal boundaries and multiple counts of unauthorized entry. He also filed a request for a restraining order preventing Karen from stepping foot on my land without prior written consent. Then, we initiated a claim for property damage, listing the broken fire pit, the nails in my trees, the tire ruts across my lawn, and a used champagne flute someone had left on the roof of my boat shed. The total claim was just under $4,000. It wasn't about the money, it was about proving a point. Word started to spread. Roger, the old surveyor, called me one evening chuckling. "You stirred the beehive, son," he said. Apparently, Karen had been crying at the HOA meeting, insisting that I was turning the community against her. Some members backed her, others didn't.